A city breathes in the dark. New York City, its lungs full of fog, its arteries glowing faintly with streetlight amber. November 28, 1953. 2 a.m. 7th Avenue stretches below like a cold ribbon of steel and shadow. Almost empty. A cab glides past. A lone figure vanishes into the night. Traffic signals rotate endlessly, red, yellow, green, performing for no one. The city keeps time even when the witnesses are gone. The Statler Hotel looms above it all, stone and glass stacked like a mausoleum built for the living. Inside, on the 13th floor, in room 1018A, a man stands at the window. Frank Olson. 43 years old. Biochemist. Government scientist. Father of 3. He is barefoot, dressed in wrinkled sleepwear. His hair is unkempt, damp with sweat. His fingers tremble as they hover inches from the glass. He has not moved for 20 minutes. Not forward. Not back. Just staring. Far below, the pavement waits. Frank's breathing is shallow and uneven, like someone drowning on dry land. His reflection stares back at him in the windowpane, warped by city light. The man looking back doesn't feel familiar anymore. Behind him, another man sleeps. Robert Lashbrook. Colleague. Escort. Watcher. Not a title spoken aloud, but understood. He brought Frank to New York 3 days earlier. Said it was for help. Said a doctor would see him. A psychiatrist. A chance to stabilize. That was the word they used. Stabilize. What it really meant was this. Frank Olson was unraveling. For 9 days, his mind had been slipping sideways. Thoughts felt foreign. Sounds arrived too late or too early. Faces lingered too long in crowds. Shadows felt deliberate. Intentional. Someone was always watching. Someone was always listening. Sleep had abandoned him. When exhaustion finally dragged him under, the dreams were unbearable, hyperreal, violent, invasive. He woke screaming, soaked in terror, clawing at a reality that no longer felt solid. At home in Maryland, his wife Alice watched the transformation with horror. 1 week earlier, he had been steady, gentle, present. Then something fractured. Overnight, the man she loved began speaking in riddles, flinching at footsteps, staring into nothing as if receiving messages she couldn't hear. Frank knew exactly when it started. November 19, 1953. A secluded cabin in western Maryland. A work retreat. Dinner plates cleared. Laughter fading. Glasses raised. A small pour of liqueur. Clear. Innocent. Control samples, they called them. Frank drank without hesitation. He didn't know someone had altered his glass. Didn't know that 80 micrograms of lysergic acid diethylamide had been dissolved into the liquid. Didn't know he was now part of an experiment he never agreed to join. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. Reality peeled apart. Time bent. Paranoia surged like a flood breaking through a dam. Faces warped. Thoughts echoed back distorted and hostile. The world no longer obeyed rules. And when the drug finally released him, it didn't let go completely. Something stayed behind. 9 days later, Frank still hadn't come back. Now, standing at the window, he isn't afraid of the fall. He's afraid of his own thoughts. Afraid of what was done to him. Afraid of what he now knows. Afraid that his mind, once disciplined and precise, is no longer under his control. Afraid that this is permanent. That this is the rest of his life. The mattress creaks softly as Lashbrook shifts in his sleep. Frank doesn't turn around. Instead, he watches the lights below pulse and change. He thinks of Alice. Of Eric, 9 years old. Lisa, 6. Little Neil's only 5. He wonders what story they'll be told. He wonders which parts of the truth will be buried deeper than his body ever could be. The window is closed. But not locked. It would take seconds. A hand. A push. One motion. No more fear. No more watching. No more experiments. Not by hands on his back, but by something far more insidious. Psychological pressure. Systematic destabilization. Deliberate erosion of identity. He was dismantled piece by piece by a classified initiative that viewed the human mind as raw material. A program that treated consciousness like a machine to be disassembled, rewired, and if necessary, discarded. A program that dosed citizens without consent. That induced terror as a research variable. That shattered psyches simply to observe the fracture lines. This was not an accident. This was methodology. For 20 years, this operation functioned in absolute secrecy. Thousands were pulled into its orbit, prisoners, patients, soldiers, civilians. Men and women who never volunteered. Who never signed forms. Who never knew their suffering was intentional. Families were destroyed. Memories wiped clean. Lives reduced to silence, madness, or death. All justified by 2 words that ended all debate. National security. Frank Olson was the first confirmed casualty. He would not be the last. This is the story of MKUltra. Not a myth. Not a rumor. Not a fever dream of conspiracy culture. A documented, government-funded campaign of psychological experimentation so extreme that it forces us to reconsider the limits of what a democracy is capable of doing to its own people. A nightmare that reveals a terrifying truth. The most dangerous monsters do not lurk in the dark. They sit behind desks. They sign paperwork. They operate under fluorescent lights with security clearances and limitless budgets. Before we descend any deeper, understand this. What follows is not speculation. It is archived history, buried, redacted, and reluctantly admitted only after the damage was irreversible. Tonight, we move downward, into America's hidden laboratories. Into psychiatric hospitals where healing was replaced with domination. Into university basements where ethics collapsed under grant money. Into sealed rooms where science crossed a line it could never uncross. This is where experimentation became torture. Where medicine became a weapon. Where the human mind was pushed until it broke. We will trace the obsession back to its origin, deep within the paranoia of the Cold War, where fear of enemies justified anything done in the name of defense. We will follow the work of Sidney Gottlieb, the scientist tasked with one impossible mission, to crack the human mind open like a safe and extract total control. We will enter the rooms where prisoners were drugged into oblivion, where psychiatric patients were erased instead of treated, where ordinary citizens were subjected to isolation, electroshock, and chemical assaults until their identities dissolved. And most importantly, we will hear from the victims. Those who lost years of their lives. Those whose memories never returned. Those who walked into the program and never truly came back out. This is not a story meant to comfort. It is meant to be remembered. Some never survived it. Others did, but only because death felt like mercy compared to what had been done to their minds. Like Frank Olson, there were those who chose the end over living inside a shattered self. And this is only the beginning. Because what followed his death was not confession, but concealment. We will see how an accident, a bureaucratic slip, a misfiled document, cracked open one of America's darkest sealed vaults. How a truth never meant to surface bled into the light for just a moment before hands rushed to bury it again. We will trace how this real-world nightmare infected popular culture, how echoes of it surfaced decades later in stories of erased memories, manufactured identities, and invisible handlers. And yet, those fictional versions are restrained, sanitized, because reality did not require dramatic exaggeration. Reality was worse. We will confront the most unsettling truth of all. Most of the evidence is gone. Destroyed. Shredded. Burned on orders that left no paper trail. The architects of these experiments lived full lives. They died quietly. They were never tried. Never punished. And the complete scope of what was done, how many minds were damaged, how many lives were lost, may never be known. This is not a story about successful mind control. Despite years of obsession, absolute control was never achieved. This is something far more disturbing. This is a story about what happens when an institution decides that its objectives excuse any cruelty. When national security becomes a license for abuse. When human beings are reclassified as acceptable losses. This is the story of MKUltra. An American nightmare that did not come from fiction. It happened. To understand how this could exist, you must understand the fear that created it. The year is 1945. World War II has ended, but peace does not follow. Two former allies, the United States and the Soviet Union, begin circling each other like predators, bound by mutual suspicion. A new kind of conflict is taking shape. Not one of trenches and invasions, but espionage. Ideology. Nuclear annihilation held just one decision away. This is the beginning of what history will later call the Cold War. A war of shadows. And at its center, the human mind. The perceived communist threat was not only military. It was psychological. Americans were taught to believe that ideology itself could infect a population. That propaganda could rewrite beliefs. That loyalty was malleable. That a person could be reprogrammed. Then came Korea. In 1950, war erupted on the Korean peninsula. American troops were deployed into brutal terrain and relentless combat. When some of those soldiers eventually returned home, something felt wrong. They gave public confessions, spoke against their own country, praised communism. Some refused to return at all, choosing captivity over repatriation. Their voices sounded altered. Their convictions reversed. The word that spread, first in whispers and then in headlines, was brainwashing. The belief took hold that Chinese and North Korean forces had unlocked a terrifying capability, the ability to erase identity and install obedience. Whether it was true mattered less than this. America believed it. And belief unlocks funding. Belief justifies extremes. The reasoning was simple. Seductive. Catastrophic. If the enemy could control minds, then America had to do it first. They would study it, replicate it, perfect it. Even if that meant experimenting on their own citizens. Even if it meant breaking people beyond repair. In the paranoia-soaked atmosphere of the early Cold War, the intelligence community was handed extraordinary power. Vast resources, minimal oversight, near total secrecy. And with that authority, they opened the door to something that should never have existed. And once opened, it could not be closed. What emerged next wore friendly names. Names that sounded harmless, almost playful. Project Bluebird, Project Artichoke. And finally, beginning in 1953, MKUltra. Labels chosen carefully. Words designed to soften what lay beneath. MK referred to the CIA's technical services staff. Ultra was borrowed from the Allied code-breaking triumph of World War II, a reference steeped in grim irony considering what this new program would become. The mission statement was written in dense, antiseptic language, the kind bureaucracies used to conceal brutality behind syllables. Research and development of chemical, biological, and radiological materials capable of employment in clandestine operations to control human behavior. Translated into plain terms, can we control thought? Emotion? Obedience? Can memories be erased or fabricated? Can a person be made to kill without knowing why? Can loyalty be stripped away and replaced? Can our own operatives be rendered immune to pain, fear, or interrogation? Can we play God with the human mind? The answer, when it came, was chillingly simple. Let's find out. And if people are destroyed along the way, that is the cost of doing business. The progression of these programs reads like a slow descent into sanctioned insanity. 1950. Project Bluebird begins. Its stated goals appear restrained, almost reasonable by intelligence standards. Improve interrogation. Learn how to spot deception. Protect agents from enemy questioning. The techniques are already unsettling. Hypnosis. Chemical truth serums. Extended isolation. But in hindsight, Bluebird feels like a warm-up. A rehearsal. 1951. Bluebird is renamed Artichoke. The reason is mundane and revealing. In intelligence culture, renaming a project makes it easier to expand budgets, bury paper trails, and evade oversight. Artichoke asks darker questions. Can we induce amnesia on command? Can we make someone forget an interrogation entirely? Can we force an individual to commit acts against their will and erase the memory afterward? The methods escalate. Stronger drugs, longer isolation, deeper sensory deprivation. Ethical boundaries soften, then dissolve. Still, Artichoke remains limited, fragmented, underfunded. It exists, but it does not yet dominate the agency's imagination. That changes in 1953. April 13, 1953. CIA Director Alan Dulles signs off on a new initiative. Bigger. More aggressive. Unrestrained. MKUltra. The funding alone signals a shift. $25 million at the time, roughly $30 million today, and that figure only reflects what survived on paper. Black programs have a way of growing far beyond their recorded budgets. The structure is staggering. 149 subprojects, eventually expanding to at least 183. Each one probing a different way to fracture, bend, or overwrite human behavior. Chemical assault. Hypnosis. Electroshock. Sleep deprivation. Psychological degradation. Sexual humiliation. Physical torment. The reach spreads quietly. At least 80 institutions become involved: universities, hospitals, prisons, pharmaceutical firms. Many never realize who is truly funding their work. Money is funneled through front organizations with bland, respectable names. On paper, it looks like harmless research. In practice, it is a nationwide laboratory. And at the center of it all, conducting this orchestra of suffering, is a man named Sidney Gottlieb. If you imagine a villain carved from shadow, sharp features, cruel eyes, theatrical menace, you are mistaken. Gottlieb looks ordinary. Short. Broad. Receding hairline. Thick glasses. The kind of man you might mistake for a quiet academic. A neighbor. Someone's forgettable uncle. And that is what makes him terrifying. Because the most profound damage in history is rarely carried out by monsters who look the part, but by men who appear completely harmless. There was nothing outwardly frightening about him. No sharp edges. No theatrical cruelty. No visible hunger for power. Sidney Gottlieb was born with a club foot, a condition that left him with a permanent limp. He moved slowly and deliberately. He spoke in a gentle, measured cadence, the careful precision of a man trained to weigh every word. In his private life, he seemed almost aggressively wholesome. He lived on a modest farm in rural Virginia with his wife and children. They cultivated their own food, raised goats, kept beehives. Gottlieb believed in organic agriculture long before it was fashionable. He cherished folk traditions. He was an accomplished folk dancer. On weekends, music spilled from his barn as he and his wife hosted square dances for friends and neighbors. Every December, he personally selected and donated Christmas trees to children's hospitals. A devoted father. A reliable neighbor. A man who cared deeply about tradition, sustainability, and family. And at work, he became one of the most destructive figures in American history. Gottlieb held a doctorate in chemistry from Caltech. His mind was formidable, creative, unconventional, capable of seeing solutions where others saw dead ends. The intelligence community noticed. He was recruited in 1951. By 1953, he was placed in command of MKUltra. For the next 20 years, he would oversee a sprawling network of experiments that shattered hundreds, possibly thousands, of lives. He personally approved the covert administration of LSD to people who never consented. He authorized electroshock treatments at intensities far beyond accepted medical limits. He sanctioned prolonged sensory deprivation until subjects lost their grip on reality. He ordered the establishment of covert brothels, locations where sex workers secretly drugged clients while intelligence officers observed from behind two-way mirrors, documenting confusion, terror, and humiliation as if it were laboratory output. And he did it all without visible emotion. No rage. No sadism. No hesitation. To Gottlieb, this was not cruelty. It was research. The people subjected to these procedures were not human beings in any meaningful sense. They were test units. Variables. Disposable inputs. Acceptable losses. That phrase appears again and again in internal thinking from this era. Gottlieb reportedly justified his work with chilling clarity. The enemy will not hesitate to use extreme methods. Neither can we. It's a seductive argument. We are the righteous ones. They are the monsters. So if we must briefly become monstrous, only in secret, only in laboratories, then surely history will forgive us. This reasoning is ancient. It has excused atrocities across centuries. Our cause is pure. Our intentions are noble. The outcome will justify everything. But there is a truth this logic refuses to confront. The methods are the outcome. What you do defines what you become. And what Gottlieb did was torture people. Not enemy operatives. Not foreign infiltrators. American citizens. Men and women who never volunteered. Who were never informed. Who never had the chance to say no. And after approving experiments that erased memories, induced psychosis, and drove people to suicide, he went home. He fed his goats. Tended his bees. Danced with his wife. Tucked his children into bed. That is the real horror of Sidney Gottlieb. Not that he was a monster, but that he was profoundly, disturbingly ordinary. That he could divide himself so completely. That he could nurture life in one space while annihilating it in another. That he could sleep soundly after signing orders that destroyed families. Because if someone so unremarkable, so kind-seeming, could do this, then anyone could. With the right fear. The right justification. The right institutional protection. That is the lesson of MKUltra. The monsters are not different from us. They are simply people granted unchecked authority, and told that certain lives no longer count. And that truth should unsettle you far more than any demon or ghost. Because demons are myths. Men like Sidney Gottlieb were real. In 1953, The CIA gave him near total freedom and virtually no oversight, then asked him a single question. Can the human mind be controlled? What followed was inevitable. Lysergic acid diethylamide. LSD-25. In the early 1950s, it was a scientific curiosity, recently synthesized by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1938. Its true power remained unknown until 1943, when Hofmann accidentally absorbed a small amount through his skin. What followed, he later wrote, was a cascade of color, a distortion of time, a radical alteration of consciousness. A doorway had opened, and the intelligence community was already waiting on the other side. By the early 1950s, psychiatrists were approaching LSD cautiously, almost reverently. In controlled settings, researchers wondered if it could ease depression, interrupt addiction, unlock buried trauma. The language was therapeutic, clinical, hopeful. The intelligence community saw none of that. They saw a weapon. To Sidney Gottlieb, LSD was not a medicine. It was a master key. A solvent capable of dissolving identity itself. Truth serum. Compliance accelerator. Memory eraser. Reality disruptor. A chemical crowbar for the human psyche. If MKUltra was ever going to succeed, this substance would be at its center. But to understand what LSD could truly do, ethical trials were useless. Informed consent ruined the data. Preparation softened the impact. Medical supervision limited the damage. Gottlieb didn't want moderation. He wanted collapse. He wanted to know what happened when the drug arrived without warning. When perception shattered without explanation. When terror bloomed with no narrative to contain it. So the CIA abandoned the laboratory and took the experiment into the real world. They began with agency personnel, on paper, volunteers. In reality, refusal wasn't an option when a superior made the suggestion. Even so, these tests disappointed Gottlieb. The agents knew something was coming. They had context. They had language for the experience. That made them resilient. Unacceptable. What Gottlieb needed was panic. Confusion. Total psychological freefall. So the rules changed. People were dosed without being told. This was not a handful of rogue incidents. It was standard procedure. Written into practice. Quietly normalized. For years, operatives were authorized to introduce LSD into drinks at dinner parties, restaurants, office gatherings, hotel bars. Targets were selected for convenience, not guilt. Sometimes the agents stayed nearby, pretending to be friends. Sometimes they observed from afar. Sometimes they simply watched the fallout unfold. Dosages were inconsistent by design. Some victims experienced mild distortions, walls breathing, colors bleeding. Others were pushed into full psychotic episodes, paranoia, ego death, terror so profound it permanently altered their sense of self. Human minds were stress-tested like machinery. One of those minds belonged to Frank Olson. Dosed by a supervisor. At a retreat. Without warning. Without support. When the paranoia didn't fade, when the drug's effects lingered long past its chemical lifespan, Olson began talking about leaving. About telling his wife. About walking away. Shortly after, he stood at a hotel window. 13 floors above the street. But LSD was only the opening act. MKUltra expanded aggressively, sampling anything that might fracture consciousness. Mescaline derived from peyote cactus. Psilocybin from mushrooms. Barbiturates paired with amphetamines, a chemical whiplash designed to exhaust resistance. Scopolamine, inducing delirium and memory loss. BZ, a military-grade compound capable of producing days-long hallucinations. Marijuana was tested and dismissed. Heroin. cocaine, morphine, biological toxins, experimental serums, unknown compounds whose effects were poorly understood even by those administering them. If it altered awareness, it was fair game. And the pool of test subjects was limited only by access. Prisoners, patients, soldiers, civilians. Of all the subprojects, one stands apart, not because it was more effective, but because it revealed how completely ethical restraint had evaporated. Operation Midnight Climax. Safe houses were established in San Francisco and New York. On the outside, they looked like upscale apartments, tasteful furniture, soft lighting, expensive decor. Inside the bedrooms were two-way mirrors. Sex workers were recruited and trained. Their instructions were simple. Meet men at bars. Bring them home. Slip LSD into their drinks. Proceed as normal. Behind the mirrors, intelligence officers watched. Listened. Took notes as perception unraveled. The men never knew. They assumed they'd had a lucky night. They never saw the cameras. Never heard the microphones. Never realized their panic, confusion, and vulnerability were being catalogued. The operation was overseen by George Hunter White, a former narcotics officer who seemed disturbingly comfortable with the assignment. He leaned into it. Decorated the apartments with bondage imagery. Referred to one location as his playpen. In private correspondence, he described the project with enthusiasm, almost joy. He called it fun. Not research. Not duty. Fun. The operation continued for nearly 10 years. How many victims were subjected to this, no one knows. The records were destroyed. Conservatively, dozens. More likely, hundreds. And what did the agency gain from this grotesque invasion of privacy, consent, and bodily autonomy? Very little. No reliable method of control. No programmable obedience. No replicable mind erasure. Just trauma. Lives permanently altered. And silence. The program learned almost nothing. But it took everything. The results were worthless. It turned out that watching unsuspecting men unravel while drugged and disoriented, while being observed through mirrors like insects under glass, taught the agency almost nothing about controlling the human mind. No breakthroughs. No formulas. No reliable mechanisms. And yet, they continued. Not because it worked, but because they could. Because there were no consequences. Because no one intervened. Because within the internal culture of MKUltra, anything, absolutely anything, could be reframed as research. To find the lowest point of this program, the place where ethics were not merely bent but pulverized, you have to meet Ewan Cameron. If Sidney Gottlieb was quiet and forgettable, Cameron was his opposite. Magnetic. Celebrated. Impeccably credentialed. He had served as president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association. He advised governments. He evaluated Nazi war criminals during the Nuremberg trials. By every outward measure, he was one of the most respected psychiatrists on earth. His laboratory was the Allen Memorial Institute, an imposing, elegant facility affiliated with McGill University. This was not a shadowy basement or a military bunker. This was where affluent families sent loved ones for elite psychiatric care. And inside those walls, Cameron conducted experiments that mirrored the very atrocities he had once been tasked with judging. His theory was called psychic driving. He believed mental illness stemmed from entrenched negative thought patterns, loops embedded so deeply they could not be reasoned away. His solution was radical. Erased the mind entirely. Destroyed the existing personality. Reduced the patient to nothing. then rebuild them from scratch. It was based on a catastrophic misunderstanding of consciousness. The human mind is not a machine. There is no reset button. But Cameron believed otherwise. His method unfolded in 3 stages. First, depatterning. The goal was total psychological annihilation. Patients were placed into drug-induced comas lasting days, weeks, sometimes months. Heavy sedatives kept them unconscious, waking only briefly before being submerged again. While in this state, Cameron administered electroconvulsive therapy, but not as it was medically practiced. Standard ECT used around 150 volts. Cameron applied 20 to 40 times that amount. Sessions occurred 2 or 3 times a day instead of a few times per week. He called it intensive electroshock. The seizures were so violent that bones fractured. Teeth shattered. Neural pathways were obliterated. When patients emerged, if they emerged, they often had no idea where they were, or who they were, or what year it was. That confusion was not a side effect. It was the objective. Second, extended sensory deprivation. Patients were isolated completely. Darkness. White noise. Football helmets strapped over their heads. Arms restrained. No movement. No touch. No reference points. Days. Weeks. Without sensory input, the mind collapses inward. Hallucinations bloom. Time loses meaning. Identity dissolves. Cameron described the aftermath as differential amnesia, patients unable to recall vast portions of their lives. Again, this was success. Third, psychic driving. Once the mind had been erased, Cameron attempted reconstruction. Recorded messages, commands, and affirmations were played on endless loops. 16 hours a day. For weeks. You are a good wife and mother. Over and over and over. You feel confident. You feel confident. You feel confident. He believed these phrases would imprint a new, healthy personality onto the blank slate. What they actually produced was devastation. Cameron's victims were not spies. Not criminals. Not volunteers. They were mostly women. Often middle class or wealthy. People seeking help for depression, anxiety, postpartum distress. Ordinary suffering. Ordinary lives. They had no idea their doctor was secretly funded by the CIA. No idea their treatment was part of a behavioral weapons program. No idea they were meant to be broken, not healed. Val Orlikow was a schoolteacher. She sought care after a miscarriage. She entered the institute functional, articulate, capable. Months later, she emerged unable to cook, unable to clean, unable to care for her children. Her personality had been hollowed out, replaced with something smaller. Diminished. Mary Morrow arrived seeking relief from anxiety. When her husband came to collect her after treatment, she did not recognize him. Could not read. Could not identify family members. He later said it felt like meeting a stranger wearing his wife's face. This was not medicine. It was erasure. And it was happening in plain sight, inside respected institutions, under the protection of prestige and secrecy. This was MKUltra at its deepest point. And it was still not finished. Send the next part when ready. Linda MacDonald entered treatment for depression. She left without her life. 26 years gone. Her wedding day erased. The births of her children wiped clean. Every adult memory stripped away as if it had never existed. She had to reconstruct herself from photographs. From second-hand stories told by relatives who sounded like strangers describing someone else. Like a survivor of catastrophic brain trauma, she relearned who she was by listening to others explain her to herself. This was not a rare complication. This was the objective. Ewan Cameron was not attempting to heal. He was attempting to erase, and then rebuild. That he succeeded only at destruction did not slow him down. He treated at least 53 documented patients using his psychic driving protocol. Every single one was harmed. Many were permanently disabled. Some never recovered enough to live independently again. The damage did not end with them. Families collapsed under the strain. Marriages disintegrated. Children grew up with parents who no longer recognized them, emotionally or literally. And here is the most unsettling truth of all. This was not the work of a rogue physician. This was funded. Through MKUltra. With public money. Inside a prestigious hospital affiliated with McGill University. At the Allen Memorial Institute. The agency knew exactly what Cameron was doing. They read his progress reports. They reviewed the outcomes. They saw the wreckage. And they continued writing checks. Because the data was interesting. Because maybe, just maybe, if the technique could be refined, it could be turned into a weapon. The women who walked into that hospital seeking help were sacrificed to an abstract idea called national security. Their minds were destroyed chasing a capability that would never exist. Because you cannot rebuild a personality. You can only shatter it. And once shattered, some fractures never heal. Cameron's victims, at least, existed within a hospital system. There were charts. Records. Families who noticed something was wrong. Others were not afforded even that thin protection. MKUltra deliberately sought out people who could not fight back. Who could not complain. Who would not be believed even if they did. The vulnerable. The invisible. Prisoners were ideal. What leverage did they have? Who would listen to them? They were already confined. Already discredited. The agency funded experiments inside federal prisons across the United States. Inmates were told they were testing new medications. They were not told those substances were powerful psychedelics. Some were dosed repeatedly, weekly, even daily for months. At the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, a federal prison hospital, incarcerated men were used as long-term test subjects. The incentive was simple. Participate, and receive early parole consideration. Or access to drugs as payment. Most of the men subjected to these trials were black and brown, because that is who the American prison system disproportionately contains. They were given combinations far beyond street use. LSD paired with morphine. Mescaline combined with stimulants. Experimental compounds without established names. Researchers documented everything. Which dosages induced compliance? Which combinations triggered paranoia? Which sequences broke resistance? How many were permanently damaged? No one knows. The records were destroyed. Psychiatric patients were another perfect target. Who would believe someone diagnosed with schizophrenia claiming the government was experimenting on them? The accusation itself sounds like a symptom. That was the camouflage. Patients in mental institutions were subjected to drugging, electroshock. Isolation, often without even the pretense of treatment. Their existing diagnoses made them convenient baselines. How do you control a mind already under strain? Drug addicts? Sex workers? The unhoused? Anyone living at society's margins? Anyone without advocates? Anyone whose death or disability could be dismissed as inevitable? The agency made a quiet, calculated decision about whose lives mattered. And whose did not. This was eugenics disguised as research. The same logic that powered the Tuskegee experiments. Forced sterilizations. Every medical atrocity built on the idea that some people are less human than others. And it happened here. Not centuries ago. within living memory. One of the most terrifying aspects of MKUltra had nothing to do with chemicals. It involved something far simpler. Darkness. Silence. Isolation. Sensory deprivation experiments were conducted across multiple facilities. The method was brutally minimal, and the effects devastating. No light. No sound. No touch. No smell. No taste. Nothing. The experiment was brutally simple. Take a human being and strip away every form of sensory input. Remove the outside world entirely. Then watch what happens to the mind when it has nothing left to hold on to. The intelligence agency constructed specialized chambers for this purpose. Some were pitch-black rooms, sealed and soundproofed, furnished with little more than a bare cot. Others were more elaborate, water tanks filled to body temperature, where subjects floated weightless, gravity erased, the body unable to distinguish where it ended and the environment began. There were sensory deprivation hoods. Boxes barely larger than coffins. Spaces designed not to harm the body, but to annihilate the self. Subjects were left inside for hours. Then days. Sometimes weeks. The outcomes were horrifying and entirely predictable. Within hours, hallucinations began. Colors bloomed in the darkness. Shapes crawled where nothing existed. Voices whispered from nowhere. Music played without source. Some felt phantom hands touching their skin. Others felt insects crawling beneath it. Time collapsed almost immediately. Without sunlight. Without meals. Without conversation. Minutes stretched into eternities. Hours vanished without trace. Subjects guessed they had been isolated for days when only an afternoon had passed, or believed weeks had elapsed when it had been mere hours. Cognition degraded rapidly. Thoughts slowed. Memories slipped. Language lost coherence. And then something more profound began to happen. Identity itself started to dissolve. Who are you when there is nothing to reflect you back to yourself? No voice. No face. No response. Some researchers used the term ego death. The personality structure disintegrated. The sense of being a distinct individual evaporated. What remained was not a person, but raw awareness. Floating. Terrified. Alone. The damage rarely ended when the doors were opened. Former subjects reported lasting effects. Anxiety that never fully receded. Depression. Dissociation. An enduring sense that reality was fragile, that at any moment the world could collapse back into that endless dark. But the agency did not care about permanence. They cared about leverage. How long does it take to break someone? Can isolation induce obedience? If you destroy sensory input and then reintroduce it, a voice, a light, human contact, can you condition someone to do anything to avoid returning to the void? The answer, disturbingly, was yes. After extended isolation, subjects became desperate. Grateful for any interaction. Willing to agree to almost anything if it meant never going back. No bruises. No scars. No visible violence. Just psychological devastation that could last a lifetime. And here is the darkest irony of all. These techniques did not disappear. They were refined. Standardized. Absorbed. The isolation methods, the disorientation, the environmental manipulation later resurfaced under different names in later decades, rebranded as official interrogation doctrine. The lesson learned was not this is wrong. The lesson was, this works. And that is what makes this story more than history. It never truly ended. It only learned how to hide. Now we return to the man at the window. Frank Olson. Because his death was not just a tragedy. It was the opening act of a cover-up that would stretch across decades. Olson was not insignificant. He was a biochemist with top-level clearance, working at Fort Detrick on some of the nation's most sensitive biological programs. He had been sent to Europe in the summer of 1953 to observe interrogation practices. What he witnessed disturbed him deeply. Extreme methods. Torture. Techniques that violated everything he believed the country stood for. Worse, they weren't even effective. Victims said whatever was required to make the suffering stop. When Olson returned, he began to talk. He told colleagues he wanted out. He considered leaving the program. Possibly telling his wife what he had seen. That made him dangerous. So in November of 1953, Sidney Gottlieb organized a retreat for the Special Operations Division at a cabin in western Maryland. Frank Olson was invited. Dinner was served. Afterward, drinks were poured. Control glasses, so everyone thought. But one of them had been altered. Gottlieb slipped 80 micrograms of LSD into Olson's drink. No warning. No consent. No context. Frank Olson had no idea what was about to happen. He drank it. Within an hour, the world began to come apart. Walls seemed to inhale and exhale. Faces warped into unfamiliar masks. Ordinary sounds echoed with hostile intent. A creeping certainty took hold that something was profoundly wrong, and that it was not going to stop. Paranoia didn't arrive gently. It flooded in. When morning came, and Frank Olson was told what had been done to him, that he had been drugged without his knowledge, something inside him fractured beyond repair. From that moment on, he was convinced the agency would silence him. That they would destroy his credibility. That they would ruin his family. That no one around him could be trusted. And the most chilling part. He wasn't wrong. Over the next 9 days, his mental state deteriorated rapidly. He was never left alone. Robert Lashbrook was assigned to stay with him at all times, presented as a colleague, functioning as a handler. A CIA-connected psychiatrist was consulted. The recommendation was immediate. Institutionalization. Not a public hospital. A private facility. One where inconvenient people could be contained quietly. Frank Olson never arrived there. On November 28, 1953, at 2:30 in the morning, he went through the window of the Statler Hotel. 13 floors above the street. Impact speed, roughly 70 miles per hour. The explanation was prepared in advance. Suicide. A psychotic episode. Drug-induced instability. Years later, his widow was given a settlement. $750,000, an enormous sum when it was finally paid in 1976. No admission of wrongdoing. Just money. And an unspoken expectation of silence. But his sons refused to let it end there. Eric and Nils Olson spent decades investigating their father's death. In 1994, they had his body exhumed. What the forensic pathologist found was disturbing. There was evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, injuries consistent with a blow to the head. There was no glass embedded in his wounds. The conclusion was unavoidable. Frank Olson was likely unconscious, or already dead, before he went out the window. This was not suicide. It was homicide. The official position has never changed. But consider what this implies. A government scientist witnesses atrocities committed in the name of his work. He expresses moral objection. He wants out. So his superiors dose him with a powerful hallucinogen without consent, knowing full well the risks. When he begins to unravel, when he becomes a liability, he dies. His death is staged. The evidence is buried. The family is paid. The files are destroyed. Frank Olson did not fall. He was pushed by an institution that decided his conscience made him expendable. And his death is simply the first one we know about. How many others were labeled accidents? How many suicides were something else entirely? How many voices vanished because they knew too much, or cared too much? We will never know. The records are gone. But death, at least, is an ending. Some victims endured something far worse. They survived. And lost everything that made them who they were. Velma Orlikow sought help in 1956 after a miscarriage. She was a teacher, a wife, a mother, a capable adult struggling with grief and depression. She trusted her doctor. She was sent to the Allen Memorial Institute. Over the following months, she was subjected to the full protocol. Prolonged drug-induced comas. Extreme electroshock. Isolation. Endless tape loops whispering commands into her unconscious mind. When she emerged, she was no longer herself. She could not care for her children. Could not manage daily tasks. Could not teach. Could not function independently. Her personality had been erased. Her family described her as a different person altogether. The woman who entered treatment was gone. What returned wore her face, but lacked her memories, her skills, her inner life. Her husband later said that when he picked her up, he felt like he was taking home a stranger. She looked like my wife, he said. But she wasn't her. Mary Morrow's story is even more devastating because of how ordinary it began. Anxiety. Not psychosis. Not trauma. Anxiety, the kind millions experience and recover from. After treatment, she could not read. The ability to recognize written words, something learned in childhood, had vanished. She could not recognize her own family. She would look at her husband of 20 years and see a stranger. The damage was so severe that she required lifelong care. She survived. But the person she had been did not. And this was not a failure of the program. This was its outcome. She came in with anxiety. Not psychosis. Not delusion. Not danger to herself or others. Anxiety. The kind that fills waiting rooms every day. The kind that responds to therapy, support time. But what happened to her was irreversible. And yet, even that was not the most devastating case. That distinction belongs to Linda MacDonald. She was in her 20s. A young mother. She had just given birth to her second child and felt overwhelmed, exhausted, unmoored. Postpartum depression. A common, well-documented condition. Treatable. Temporary. She asked for help. And that decision erased her life. Under the care of Ewan Cameron, Linda was subjected to months of depatterning and psychic driving. Drug-induced comas that stretched on for weeks. Electroshock administered at voltages far beyond accepted medical limits. Isolation. Darkness. Endless recorded messages played into her unconscious mind. When she was finally released, she had lost 26 years of memory. 26 years. Her wedding vanished. Meeting her husband erased. The births of her children gone. Her entire adult existence had been stripped away. Her family had to rebuild her identity for her using photographs and stories. This is your husband. You married him in 1954. This is your son. You gave birth to him in 1956. Imagine being taught your own life like a lesson in someone else's history. Linda could form new memories. She could function, superficially. But the person she had been, the accumulation of 26 years of love, growth, struggle, and joy, was gone forever. She lived the rest of her life with a void where her identity should have been. All because she asked for help. These women were not collateral damage. They were the experiment. Cameron was testing whether a personality could be erased and reconstructed. He proved the first part was possible. The second part never worked. And yet, He kept going. Patient after patient. Mind after mind. Life after life. And the funding continued. Because the data was interesting. Because maybe the next subject would be the breakthrough. Because the women being destroyed mattered less than the hypothetical weapon they represented. But the destruction did not end with them. It spread. Like shockwaves from an explosion. Husbands became caretakers for wives who no longer recognized them. Children grew up with mothers who could not mother, who asked their own kids who they were. Imagine being 6 years old and hearing your parent ask, "Who are you?" Holidays vanished. Birthdays became meaningless. Entire childhoods unfolded without acknowledgement from the person who was supposed to remember them most. Some spouses stayed. Out of love. Out of duty. Out of guilt. Others left, because they could not bear watching a stranger inhabit the body of the person they loved. There were no good choices. Only impossible ones. Careers collapsed. Financial ruin followed. Medical costs mounted. Families lost income when victims could no longer work. Destroying a mind destroys an ecosystem. And for what? What was gained? No reliable mind control. No programmable assassins. No dependable truth serum. No method to erase memory without annihilating the self. After decades of suffering, nothing. The victims gained nothing. Their families gained nothing. Society gained nothing. Only the perpetrators gained something. The knowledge that they could act without consequence. That secrecy protected cruelty. That power could erase accountability. That some lives could be written off as expendable. That is the true legacy of MKUltra. Not control. Impunity. And the most unsettling truth of all is that this lesson was never unlearned. And that lesson stuck. It hardened. It became doctrine. The experiments themselves failed. No mind control. No programmable obedience. No miracle weapon. But the program succeeded in something far more dangerous. It proved that the American government could torture its own citizens and suffer no real consequences. That is the most horrifying legacy of all. MKUltra was never meant to be exposed. Secrecy was not a byproduct of the program. It was its final safeguard. And for a long time, that safeguard held. Almost. By 1973, pressure was mounting. Trust in government was collapsing. Watergate was tearing the illusion of moral authority to shreds. Congress and the press were circling the intelligence community. That's when the order came. Destroy everything. The directive was issued by Richard Helms, then Director of Central Intelligence. All MKUltra files were to be eliminated. Every report. Every memo. Every subject file. Every financial trail. Nothing could remain. To oversee the erasure, one man was brought back. Sidney Gottlieb. He had retired in 1972. Now he returned for one final task. For months, he worked systematically, reducing 2 decades of history to ash. Shredders ran continuously. Furnaces burned day and night. Documents were pulped, incinerated, erased. This was not panic. It was procedure. By the time he was finished, roughly 80% of MKUltra's documentation no longer existed. Gone. Destroyed before investigators could ever see it. And that should have been the end. Without evidence, the program would survive only as rumor. As whispers. As accusations that could be dismissed as paranoia. But something survived. Something mundane. Something overlooked. Accounting. The financial records. They were stored separately. Filed elsewhere. Managed by a different department. and approximately 20,000 pages remained untouched. In 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh began digging into domestic intelligence abuses while following the trail left by Watergate. What he uncovered shocked the nation. The intelligence agency, supposedly restricted to foreign operations, had been spying on Americans. Anti-war activists, journalists, political dissidents. The revelation detonated public trust. In response, President Gerald Ford established the Rockefeller Commission to investigate abuses of power. Soon after, Congress launched its own inquiry. The Church Committee, chaired by Frank Church. And that's when someone found the paperwork. Buried in a budget office filing cabinet. Payment records. Grants. Transfers. References to something called MKUltra. Money flowing to universities, hospitals, prisons, pharmaceutical firms. Funds authorized for subprojects with cryptic code names. Allocations signed off by Sidney Gottlieb. The thread was pulled, and the fabric unraveled. The hearings began in 1975 and stretched into 1976. Under subpoena, the intelligence agency was forced to admit the program existed. Richard Helms testified. He acknowledged that MKUltra had been real. That unwitting subjects had been drugged. That oversight had been minimal to non-existent. But with most of the files destroyed, the full scope could never be reconstructed. How many victims? Thousands at least. Possibly tens of thousands. Even the agency claimed not to know. Which institutions were involved? At least 80. Universities. Hospitals. Prisons. Drug companies. Some were ignorant of who funded them. Some were not. We will never know which was which. How many deaths? Officially, 1. Frank Olson. And even that admission came only after decades of pressure from his family. How many suicides were something else? How many accidents were staged? How many people died from complications, breakdowns, overdoses, despair? The burned files carried those answers with them. The committee heard testimony from survivors. Those who were still alive. Those still coherent enough to speak. Val Orlikow. Linda MacDonald. Others whose names were sealed or lost entirely. Broken people stood before senators and described what had been done to them. The room reportedly fell silent. Some lawmakers struggled to comprehend it. This can't be America, a few said. We don't do this. But that was exactly what America had done. For 20 years. Under the banner of freedom. Under the rhetoric of democracy. The testimonies were devastating. But the agency's response was even more revealing. Not remorse. Not accountability. Justifications. Deflections. And a quiet insistence that what had been done was necessary. And that is where the true horror settles in. Not in what was exposed, but in what followed. They admitted it existed. They admitted people were drugged. They admitted there were no safeguards. But what they offered was not accountability. It was a narrative. MKUltra, they said, was a well-intentioned program carried out in an atmosphere of fear. The Cold War had warped judgment. The Soviet Union was believed to be far ahead in mind control research. America had to respond. Yes, the methods were extreme. Yes, people were harmed. But the threat was existential. It is the same justification power always reaches for. We were afraid. The enemy was terrifying. We did what we thought we had to do. And what was quietly ignored was that the program never worked. It produced no reliable intelligence. No strategic advantage. No functional mind control. It failed completely at its stated goals. That inconvenient fact barely registered in the hearings. The revelation sparked outrage. Headlines screamed. Senators vowed reform. Promises were made that this would never happen again. But here is what did not happen. Almost no one was punished. Sidney Gottlieb was never charged. He returned to his farm, grew trees, kept bees, hosted dances. He died peacefully in 1999 at 80 years old. No trial. No prison. No reckoning. Richard Helms, who ordered the destruction of evidence, was convicted of lying to Congress. The sentence? A suspended term. A $2,000 fine. $2,000 for overseeing decades of human experimentation and erasing the proof. The institutions that hosted the experiments faced nothing. Universities. Hospitals. Prisons. No sanctions. No criminal liability. The university where Ewan Cameron destroyed dozens of lives remained silent for decades. When acknowledgement finally came, it was carefully worded. Regret without consequence. Admission without accountability. In 1995, a formal apology was issued for government radiation experiments. MKUltra was not mentioned. When it was acknowledged later, it came in fragments. Footnotes. Half-statements. Never a full reckoning. The intelligence agency's position has remained essentially unchanged. Yes, it happened. Yes, it was ethically problematic. But it ended in 1973. We've learned our lesson. Trust us. Some victims eventually received compensation. After years of lawsuits, both governments paid settlements to a small number of survivors. The amounts were insulting. $100,000 for people who lost decades of memory. For lives erased. For families destroyed. And most victims received nothing. If you couldn't prove you were part of the program. If your records had been destroyed. If you died before exposure. If you were a prisoner, a psychiatric patient, an addict. You were invisible. Proof was required. But the proof had been burned. So the vast majority of victims were never acknowledged, let alone compensated. The perpetrators died free. The institutions continued operating. The techniques refined under MKUltra did not disappear. They were absorbed, renamed, normalized. And the message was unmistakable. You can get away with it. If you act in the name of national security, you can torture. You can destroy lives. You can even kill. At worst, decades later, there may be an apology. A settlement. A press release. That is not justice. It is barely recognition. The program was exposed. The people who ran it were protected. And that tells you everything about how power functions. About which lives matter, and which never did. Because 80% of MKUltra's files were destroyed, we are permanently blind. We will never know how many people were experimented on. Estimates range from hundreds to tens of thousands. We will never know which institutions knowingly participated and which were unwitting fronts. We will never know how many deaths were directly caused through suicide, overdose, electroshock complications, or quiet silencing. We will never know the full list of substances tested. Compounds without names. Formulas never used again. We will never know what the undocumented subprograms involved. Projects whose numbers exist, but whose purposes vanished with the paperwork. And we will never know for certain whether the program truly ended in 1973. It is easy to rename a project. Easy to move funding. Easy to bury continuity under new acronyms. The absence of evidence is its own kind of horror. A void where the truth should be. Questions that can never be answered. Because someone made sure the answers burned. And that is the final legacy of MKUltra. Not just what was done, but what was erased. That destruction was not panic. It was strategy. The shredding of MKUltra's records wasn't a desperate act by frightened men scrambling to save themselves. It was deliberate. Careful. Exhaustive. They knew precisely what they were erasing. They weren't destroying paperwork. They were eliminating accountability. Ensuring that no future investigation could ever reconstruct the full truth. Protecting the institution, even if it meant condemning the victims to silence forever. And it worked. Here is what makes MKUltra uniquely corrosive. It proves the nightmares were real. Every fear about intelligence agencies experimenting on citizens was true. Every suspicion about people being drugged without consent was true. Operations like Operation Midnight Climax did exactly that. Every concern that doctors and universities might secretly be working with intelligence agencies was true. Dozens of hospitals and research institutions were funded, some knowingly, some not, to facilitate human experimentation. Every anxiety about black-budget programs operating for years without oversight was true. MKUltra ran for 2 decades with enormous funding and virtually no supervision. Every suspicion that the government would destroy evidence of its own crimes was true. 80% of the documentation was intentionally erased. Every fear that those responsible would escape justice was also true. Almost no one was punished. In other words, the paranoia was justified. The most extreme conspiracy theories weren't extreme enough. Reality exceeded them. And that is toxic to democracy. Because once you know, truly know, that the government experimented on its own citizens, drugged people without consent, tortured prisoners and psychiatric patients, destroyed the proof, and protected the perpetrators. What can't you believe? MKUltra is why conspiracy thinking has such gravitational pull in modern America. Because sometimes the conspiracy is real. Sometimes the government is lying. Sometimes the most horrifying explanation is the correct one. That knowledge poisons civic trust. You can dismiss claims about microchips or mind-controlling chemicals in drinking water. But there's always an asterisk. But MKUltra happened. That is the damage that never healed. Not just the suffering inflicted on victims, but the rupture of the social contract. Once you accept that your government will harm you if it finds it useful, will lie for decades, will erase evidence, and shield those responsible, trust becomes irrational. And then something stranger happens. MKUltra becomes unreal. Not because it didn't happen, but because it's been absorbed into fiction so completely that it starts to feel imaginary. When reality is more disturbing than fantasy, fantasy borrows from reality. MKUltra has become shorthand for hidden power and institutional cruelty across films, books, games, and television. Its fingerprints are everywhere. A recent, obvious example is Stranger Things. Children subjected to secret experiments. Numbers instead of names. Isolation tanks. Sensory deprivation. A smiling authority figure who is also the architect of suffering. The parallels are not subtle. The show openly acknowledges its inspiration. Characters even reference MKUltra directly. And that's why it works. Because the foundation is real. Children with supernatural powers are fiction. Children experimented on without consent are history. The psychic abilities are invented. The abuse is documented. But fiction offers something reality never did. Escape. In the story, the victim fights back. She survives. She finds power. She finds family. There is justice, however imperfect. The real victims of MKUltra received none of that. No powers. No revenge. No reckoning. They were broken and left to live with the damage. Fiction gives us closure that reality refused. Maybe that's why these stories keep getting told. Because the truth, unchecked power, institutional cruelty, no consequences, is too bleak to sit with unfiltered. So we soften it. We add monsters we can defeat. Because the real monster was never defeated at all. So we invent endings. We tell stories where the victims become powerful, where they remember, where they fight back, where the people who hurt them are exposed, hunted, punished. It's how we survive knowing the real ending was none of those things. Take the Bourne identity and the franchise that followed. Jason Bourne is the fantasy version of MKUltra, a man created by a covert intelligence program. His memories erased. His identity rewritten. Turned into the perfect weapon. Until it breaks. Until he remembers. Until the conditioning fails and the victim becomes dangerous to the system that made him. He hunts his creators. Exposes the program. Wins. It's deeply satisfying. And it's directly inspired by reality. MKUltra included subprojects explicitly aimed at creating amnesiac operatives, assassins who could kill and forget. The agency genuinely tried to build Manchurian candidates. It never worked. Memory does not function like code. Personality cannot be installed with precision. But fiction fixes that flaw. It gives us Bourne, the survivor who becomes unstoppable. The real subjects of those subprojects, whoever they were, because the records are gone, did not gain skills or clarity or revenge. They were broken. And forgotten. The same pattern appears in The Manchurian Candidate, later adapted into film. A soldier is brainwashed during the Korean War and turned into an unwitting assassin. At the time of its publication, MKUltra was actively operating. When the program was exposed years later, the novel no longer felt like paranoia. It felt like reportage with altered names. The fears it dramatized, the idea that governments could reprogram soldiers, erase agency, weaponize minds, were not speculative. They were official objectives. Fiction didn't exaggerate reality. It mirrored it. Other stories followed. The X-Files built an entire mythology around secret experiments and institutional lies. American Horror Story, Asylum referenced mind control programs directly. Video games turned the idea into spectacle, government labs, fractured memories, hidden handlers. Even phrases like glitch in the matrix draw power from the same fear, that perception itself is unreliable, that control can be invisible. MKUltra became cultural shorthand, a symbol for corrupted science, for unchecked authority, for conspiracy that turned out to be true. But here is the uncomfortable truth. We prefer the fictional versions because fiction is merciful. Fiction gives us structure. Heroes and villains. Arcs and revelations. Victims who reclaim agency. Conspiracies that are exposed. Perpetrators who face consequences. Reality gave us none of that. The real victims of MKUltra did not escape. They did not gain power. They did not bring the system down. They suffered. They died. They were erased. And the people responsible lived full, quiet lives. No supernatural justice. No final confrontation. No catharsis. Just damage that never healed. Fiction comforts us by offering the ending we were denied. That's why these stories persist. Not because they are fantasies, but because they fix reality. They let us believe that truth will surface, that power can be challenged, that victims will be seen. MKUltra offers no such reassurance. It stands as proof that sometimes institutions win. Sometimes innocence is irrelevant. Sometimes there is no justice at all. Watch Stranger Things. Enjoy it. But remember, the horror it draws from is real. The real victims did not get superpowers. They got trauma. The real architects were not dragged into the light by brave outsiders. They walked away. And that knowledge leaves a scar that doesn't fade. Because MKUltra changed something fundamental. Before it was exposed, claims like the government experiments on its own citizens could be dismissed as paranoia. After MKUltra, they are historically accurate. Before, saying intelligence agencies drug people to control their minds sounded unhinged. Afterward, the correct response became, they tried. It failed. But yes, they did that. That is the lasting damage. Every conspiracy theory now lives in the shadow of a real one that turned out to be true. The government really did conduct secret experiments. Really did drug people without consent. Really did torture the vulnerable. Really did destroy the evidence. Really did protect the perpetrators. Once you know that, dismissal becomes harder. Trust becomes fragile. And the line between paranoia and prudence is permanently blurred. That is MKUltra's final experiment. Not on the human mind, but on belief itself. So when someone says they're putting chemicals in the water, it sounds unhinged. Until you remember this. The government actually did test whether hallucinogens could be dispersed through municipal water systems. Small-scale trials. Limited areas. Controlled conditions. It didn't work. But they tried. That is what MKUltra did to civic trust. It took ideas that should have been laughable and anchored them in documented reality. Not because every conspiracy theory is true. Most are not. But because one of the most extreme accusations imaginable, that the government secretly experimented on its own citizens, turned out to be accurate. And that changes everything. MKUltra proved that sometimes the government really is capable of the unthinkable. That institutions can be ruthless enough to sacrifice their own people for abstract objectives. And once you internalize that, every reassurance sounds different. When officials say, "Trust us, this is for national security," they said that about MKUltra too. When institutions claim we have strict ethical oversight, so did the hospitals and universities that facilitated these experiments. When scientists insist we would never experiment on humans without consent, dozens of respected researchers did exactly that for 20 years. The conspiracy theorists didn't win because all their ideas were right. They won because one foundational fear was validated. And that is MKUltra's most corrosive legacy. Not only the lives destroyed, not only the families shattered, but the permanent wound it carved into democratic trust. You cannot repair that with apologies. You cannot heal it with settlements. Once faith is broken at that scale, it does not come back. And that brings us to the present. To the questions that cannot be answered because the answers are classified, buried, or already burned. Did the research truly stop in 1973? The intelligence agency says yes. But that same agency also said the program never existed, until it was forced to admit it did. Its credibility on this subject is non-existent. What we do know is this. Institutions do not spend decades and millions of dollars developing techniques, then simply discard the knowledge. Even failure generates data. Even atrocities produce lessons. So what happened to what they learned? Was it abandoned? Or absorbed into new initiatives with new names and new budget lines? We cannot know. The only people who could answer are bound by secrecy. And they are not talking. What is visible is continuity. The isolation methods. The disorientation. The psychological pressure that leaves no bruises. After September 11th, when enhanced interrogation techniques were implemented, observers noted familiar patterns. Sensory deprivation. sleep denial, stress positions, isolation, psychological manipulation, different enemy, different justification, same mechanics. Did those methods come directly from MKUltra research? Or did institutions independently rediscover the same limited toolbox for breaking minds? We don't know. But institutional memory is real. Techniques persist. Knowledge accumulates. And nothing learned at that scale truly disappears. Are there still classified programs we don't know about? Almost certainly. Not necessarily mind control in the MKUltra sense. But something. The intelligence community operates with enormous black budgets. Funds allocated to projects the public never sees and Congress barely scrutinizes. What are those projects? What are they testing? On whom? We don't know. We never know. Until an accident happens. Until a box of documents survives the furnace. Until a financial ledger is misfiled. And even then, the truth arrives decades late, when accountability is impossible and most victims are already gone. That is the pattern. Secret atrocity. Evidence destroyed. Delayed exposure. Minimal consequences. A few settlements. A carefully worded apology. Assurances that this time it's different. Until the next revelation. Most MKUltra victims are dead now. More than half a century has passed since the program officially ended. Those experimented on in the 1950s and 60s, if they survived, are elderly or gone. Frank Olson's sons are still fighting for the truth about their father's death. They have never received it. The official position remains unchanged. Suicide. Psychotic episode. Evidence suggesting otherwise is dismissed as speculation. The family's lawsuit was thrown out. National security. In Canada, families of Cameron's victims eventually received compensation after decades of litigation. In 1988, the U.S. government paid a total of $750,000 to be divided among survivors. Dozens of lives. Roughly $100,000 each. Canadian victims received similar amounts. Many others received nothing. Some never knew they were part of the program at all. They were patients. Prisoners. People experimented on and released, or buried. Their involvement was erased with the files. They disappeared without names. Without recognition. Without justice. And that silence, that absence, is not accidental. It is the final product of MKUltra. They never received acknowledgement. They never received compensation. Their families never learned what was done to them, or why their loved ones never came back the same. Even now, more than 70 years later, the intelligence agency insists that portions of the MKUltra archive remain classified. They claim national security still demands secrecy. 70 years? Ask yourself what could possibly remain so dangerous after all this time. What truth is still too volatile to release? We will probably never know. Those files will stay sealed until everyone involved is dead. Until no one can be prosecuted. Until the information becomes safely academic, history without consequences. That is how accountability truly dies. Not in dramatic crackdowns, but in quiet delays that stretch across decades until justice ages out of relevance. Here is what must be understood clearly, without ambiguity. MKUltra failed. It did not produce mind control. It did not create Manchurian candidates. It did not yield a reliable truth serum. It did not master memory erasure or implantation. It did not rebuild personalities once destroyed. After 20 years, vast budgets, thousands of victims, and the corruption of medicine and science, the program achieved nothing of strategic value. Torture does not produce truth. Drug-induced amnesia is chaotic and irreversible. Identity can be shattered, but not reconstructed. MKUltra was a scientific dead end. A strategic failure. A catastrophic waste. But that is not the real horror. The real horror is that they tried. That they were willing to destroy thousands of lives chasing a goal that may never have been possible. That they operated with unlimited resources and almost no oversight. That they deliberately targeted the vulnerable, prisoners, psychiatric patients, the poor. That doctors and scientists abandoned ethics when institutions told them it was necessary. That they lied to Congress. Burned the evidence. Shielded the perpetrators. And that failure did not stop them. Year after year. Subject after subject. Even when the data showed nothing worked, the experiments continued. Because maybe the next one would succeed. Maybe the dosage needed to be higher. The shock longer. The isolation deeper. The real horror is how effortlessly national security justified everything. How quickly moral boundaries collapsed. How easily ordinary people, physicians, researchers, officers, became instruments of atrocity once ideology gave them permission. The real horror is that almost no one paid for it. That Sidney Gottlieb died peacefully. That institutions continued untouched. That I was following orders was accepted as explanation enough. The real horror is that MKUltra was not unique. It fit a pattern. Tuskegee. Radiation experiments. Forced sterilizations. Moments when American institutions quietly decided some lives were expendable. The real horror is that it may not be over. That techniques refined under MKUltra still echo forward. That new programs, under new names, likely exist right now. That we won't learn about them until another accidental exposure, decades from now, when accountability is impossible. The real horror is us. Our willingness to accept it. To say it was a different time. To say they were afraid. To say at least they apologized. Our desire to relegate it to history, to make it terrible but finished. It isn't finished. The people who ran MKUltra are gone. But the institution that authorized it still exists. The logic that justified it, national security above all, still guides policy. The legal frameworks that protected the perpetrators remain intact. Nothing fundamental changed. We just learned how to hide it better. So return with me one final time to the hotel room. It is 2:30 a.m. November 28th, 1953. Frank Olson stands at the window, 13 floors above 7th Avenue. The glass reflects his face, fractured by city lights. Behind him, Robert Lashbrook lies in bed, sleeping or pretending to. The room is quiet except for distant traffic and the faint hum of the city breathing below. Frank understands now. He has understood for 9 days. Since the moment his drink was altered. Since reality began to split. There is no escape. He will not be allowed to resign. He will not be allowed to speak. He will not be allowed to exist as a liability. He can see the futures prepared for him. A psychiatric facility. Permanent sedation. A life erased quietly. Or an accident. A fall. A suicide. That is what they will call it regardless. The window is closed. But it would be effortless to open. Just one motion. Just one step. But widen the frame. Pull back. Because Frank Olson is not alone at that window. Behind him, metaphorically, spiritually, stand the others. Velma Orlikow, her identity erased when she asked for help. Linda MacDonald, 26 years of life gone. Prisoners dosed in their cells. Patients shocked until memory dissolved. Men drugged in safe houses under two-way mirrors. Subjects locked in darkness until their minds broke. Hundreds. Thousands. We will never know the true number. Because the records are gone. And that is the final image. Not a demon. Not a monster. But an institution. Silent. Enduring. Still standing, all the others. The unnamed. The uncounted. The erased. Those whose names were never written down, or were written once and then fed into shredders and furnaces until nothing remained but ash. Each of them stood at their own edge. Their own window. Their own precipice. Their own moment where life had become unbearable, and the idea of ending it felt like mercy. Some jumped. Some were pushed. Some simply fell. The distinction barely matters when gravity takes over. What matters is why they fell. They fell because someone in authority decided they were expendable. Because an institution decided certain lives mattered less than strategic advantage. Because national security became a permission slip for anything. They fell because American democracy, despite its language of freedom and dignity, has a fatal flaw. When power concentrates. When it operates in secrecy. When crimes can be classified. When evidence can be destroyed. When following orders is treated as absolution. Atrocity becomes policy. Policy becomes routine. Routine becomes invisible. Until something slips through. A ledger. A forgotten box of files. A family that refuses to stop asking questions. Until history stumbles over what was meant to stay buried. And once again, we learn the same terrible lesson. The worst conspiracy theories were understatements. Reality was worse. The monsters were real. They wore suits. They carried badges. They held clearances. They went home to their families at night after authorizing acts of cruelty that defy comprehension. Frank Olson went through that window. His body struck the pavement at 70 miles per hour. The intelligence agency called it suicide. 22 years later, the truth began to leak out. And even now, it is incomplete. Obscured. Fragmented by classification, destruction, and institutional stonewalling. How many others went through their own windows? How many suicides were something else entirely? How many victims died alone, confused, terrified, convinced they were losing their minds, never knowing they had been used? We do not know. We cannot know. The evidence was burned. And that deliberate erasure, the systematic destruction of truth, may be the greatest crime of all. Because it guarantees this. No full accounting. No complete justice. No final reckoning. This happened in America. Not centuries ago. Within living memory, we got caught. Most of the files are gone. And next time, most of the perpetrators died free. And not somewhere, 80%, inside some secure building, all of behind badge-locked doors, welcome to the real nightmare. Someone is likely running not the next hypothetical one. Because the lesson of MKUltra was not never do this again. The one that actually happened. The lesson was, the one that may still be happening, under different names, justified by new fears, waiting decades to be discovered when it's too late for accountability. This is not a warning about what could happen. It is a record of what did happen. What likely is happening. And what will happen again, if secrecy, fear, and unchecked power are allowed to coexist. That was MKUltra. Not a story about imagination. A documented horror. Proven by government records. Confirmed by victim testimony. Admitted only when denial was no longer possible. Remember it. Because forgetting is how it happens again.